You've been taught that morality is virtue, that having strong ethical principles makes you good, that refusing to compromise your morals, regardless of cost, is the mark of character. And while you've been believing this, while you've been limiting yourself with rigid moral constraints, people without your ethical boundaries have been taking everything: the job you deserved, the relationship you wanted, the opportunities you turned down because they felt wrong, the success that should have been yours. They took it all, not because they're better than you, but because they're willing to do things you won't. Francis Bacon lived in a world where moral people were destroyed daily, where ethical constraints meant losing to those who had none, where principles were beautiful in theory but deadly in practice, and he recognized something that comfortable society refuses to acknowledge: that morality is a luxury, something you can afford when you're strong enough that ethical constraints won't destroy you, but something that becomes a trap when you're weak, competing, climbing. That rigid morals in a world where others have none is strategic suicide. That being unwilling to bend ethics when necessary means watching less moral people win everything. This is not an argument for becoming evil. This is not advocacy for cruelty or unnecessary harm. This is brutal recognition of reality, that in competition with people who operate without moral constraints, having rigid moral constraints is a disadvantage. That in environments where unethical behavior is rewarded and ethical behavior is punished, maintaining strict ethics means accepting inferior outcomes. That morality, however admirable, has costs, real costs, measured in lost opportunities, failed competitions, and watching less ethical people prosper. So let's break down why Francis Bacon would say having morals is often the worst strategic choice you can make. Why ethical constraints that feel noble actually make you weaker. Why being unwilling to do what others are willing to do guarantees they win and you lose. Why morality, however comfortable it feels, is often a cage that keeps you from getting what you want and deserve. Let's start with the fundamental problem. Morals are constraints. Every ethical principle you hold is a behavior you won't engage in. Every moral line you won't cross is a strategy you won't use. Every value you maintain is a limitation on your options. And in competitive environments, where others are using every available strategy and you're limiting yourself to ethical ones, you're handicapped. You're competing with one hand tied behind your back by ethics they don't share. Think about this practically. You won't lie. So, when situations require deception to succeed, you fail while others who will lie succeed. You won't betray confidences. So others use information you have, but won't deploy while they exploit everything they learn. You won't manipulate emotions. So others use emotional manipulation effectively, while you're limited to rational argument that's often less persuasive. You won't exploit weaknesses, so others exploit vulnerabilities you could see but won't use because it feels wrong. Your morals create asymmetry. You're playing by rules they're not following. And in that asymmetry, they have advantages you don't. More options, more flexibility, more willingness to do whatever works. They're not better people. They're just less constrained. And less constrained beats more constrained in competition unless the constrained person has overwhelming advantages in other domains, which most people don't. Bacon observed this constantly in political competition. The most moral people rarely won. The people who won were those willing to use whatever tactics worked, to lie when lying served them, to betray when betrayal was profitable, to manipulate when manipulation was effective. They weren't constrained by ethics that limited their options. And this lack of constraint gave them systematic advantages over more moral competitors. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. The world doesn't reward morality consistently. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. Sometimes being ethical creates trust that leads to opportunities. But often being ethical just means you don't pursue opportunities that unethical people take. Sometimes maintaining principles earns respect, but often it just means you lose to people who don't maintain principles, and nobody respects you anyway because you lost. The idea that morality is rewarded, that good people get good outcomes, that ethics pay off in the long run, this is comfortable fiction. Reality is more complex and often less fair. Sometimes moral people prosper. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes immoral people are punished. Sometimes they're not. Often they prosper specifically because they're willing to do things moral people won't. And pretending otherwise, pretending morality is always rewarded, keeps moral people trapped in patterns that don't serve them. Bacon watched moral people destroyed while immoral people thrived. And not occasionally, regularly, systematically. The pattern was clear. Those willing to bend or break ethical rules when necessary had advantages. Those who maintained rigid ethics regardless of cost often paid catastrophic prices. The world wasn't fair, wasn't just, wasn't set up to reward virtue, and operating as if it was meant accepting disadvantages that hurt you while others exploited advantages you refused. Let's talk about predictability. When you have known moral constraints, when people understand what you won't do, you become predictable. And predictability in competitive environments is weakness. People can maneuver you into situations where your ethics limit your options, while their lack of ethics doesn't limit theirs. They can exploit your unwillingness to do certain things. They can use your moral constraints against you. You won't retaliate against someone who's harmless even if they've harmed you. So they can attack you without fear of consequences. You won't betray allies even if those allies betray you first, so they can betray you safely knowing you won't respond in kind. You won't use dirty tactics even if dirty tactics are being used against you. So they can fight dirty while you fight clean and win through their willingness to do what you won't. Your morals become a playbook for defeating you. Anyone who understands your ethical constraints knows your limitations. Knows what pressures you'll respond to and what pressures you won't. Knows what threats are credible and what threats you won't follow through on because they'd violate your principles. This predictability is exploitable, and people who operate without moral constraints will exploit it. Bacon understood that strategic unpredictability requires freedom from rigid constraints, that maintaining options requires being willing to use those options. That credible threats require actual willingness to follow through. If people know you won't do certain things because of ethics, they know they can push you in those directions without real risk. Your morals telegraph your limits, and your limits become their advantages. Now let's discuss moral flexibility versus moral rigidity. Bacon wasn't arguing for complete amorality. He was arguing against rigid morality, against treating ethics as absolute rules that can never bend, regardless of circumstances. Because rigid morality in a complex world leads to absurd outcomes, situations where maintaining principle produces worse results than compromising would. Think about ethical dilemmas. You've promised to keep a secret, but keeping it will cause serious harm. Rigid morality says keep the promise no matter what. Flexible morality asks whether the principle of keeping promises is more important than preventing harm. Most people intuitively understand that sometimes breaking a promise is the right choice, but they don't apply that understanding consistently. They stay rigid when flexibility would serve them and others better. You've committed to honesty, but honesty in this situation will destroy something valuable. Rigid morality says be honest anyway. Let the destruction happen. Your principles matter more than outcomes. Flexible morality asks whether honesty in this case serves any real value or just satisfies your need to feel morally pure, regardless of consequences. Sometimes lies prevent harm, and preventing harm might be more ethical than rigid adherence to honesty. Bacon advocated situational ethics, not abandoning all principles, but being willing to bend principles when circumstances make rigid adherence counterproductive or harmful. This doesn't mean no ethics. It means smart ethics, strategic ethics, ethics that account for context and consequences rather than treating rules as absolute regardless of outcomes. But most people can't do this. They treat morals as identity, as non-negotiable parts of who they are, and this rigidity makes them vulnerable to anyone operating with flexibility. Because flexible ethics can adapt to circumstances, can choose optimal strategies based on situation, can bend when bending serves interests, while rigid ethics are stuck, constrained, limited to strategies that fit moral framework regardless of whether those strategies work. Here's the brutal economics of morality. Every moral constraint you maintain is an opportunity cost. It's potential benefit you're giving up to maintain the constraint. Sometimes that trade is worth it. The benefit of maintaining the principle exceeds the cost of lost opportunity. But often it's not. The cost exceeds the benefit. You're paying more to maintain your principles than those principles are actually worth. Think about career advancement. There are opportunities that require ethical compromise, not necessarily evil acts, but gray areas, taking credit for others' work, undermining competitors, strategic deception. If you won't do these things and others will, they advance and you don't. Over time, this compounds. They accumulate advantages from willingness to compromise ethics. You stay plateaued because you won't. The cost of your morals is measurable career limitation. Think about business success. Many profitable opportunities require ethical flexibility, not illegal necessarily, but morally gray, exploiting information asymmetries, taking advantage of people's ignorance or desperation, pushing legal but unethical advantage. If you won't, and competitors will, they profit, and you don't. Your morals cost you money. Real money. Money that goes to people with fewer moral constraints. Think about relationships and social status. Sometimes getting what you want requires manipulation, strategic dishonesty, exploiting others' weaknesses. If you won't do these things and others will, they get the relationships and status while you don't. Your morals cost you social outcomes. Real outcomes. Outcomes that go to people willing to be less ethical than you. Bacon would ask, is maintaining your principles worth these costs? Sometimes yes. Sometimes the principle matters more than the benefit. But often no. Often you're paying catastrophic prices to maintain principles that don't actually serve you or anyone else. You're just making yourself weaker to feel morally superior. And moral superiority doesn't compensate for actual inferiority in outcomes. Let's talk about the morality trap. Society teaches you to be moral, to have principles, to maintain ethics regardless of personal cost. Why? Because it's good for society. Moral people are predictable, controllable, unlikely to disrupt systems, unlikely to take aggressive action to change their circumstances. They stay in their lane, follow rules, accept outcomes even when outcomes are unjust. They're easy to manage. But society's interest in you being moral doesn't align with your interest in succeeding. Society benefits from your ethical constraints. You don't necessarily. Society wants you to be good, to play fair, to accept results of competitions where others weren't playing fair. Because if everyone plays fair, system is stable. But if you play fair and others don't, you lose. Your morality serves them, not you. Bacon recognized this, that morality was often a control mechanism, a way of keeping potentially threatening people contained by ethical constraints they wouldn't violate. If you convince someone that certain actions are wrong, that maintaining principles matters more than outcomes, you've limited their options without using force. They'll limit themselves. They'll stay weak voluntarily because staying strong would require violating ethics you've convinced them are essential. This doesn't mean all morality is control. Some ethical principles serve everyone, including you. But it means you need to question whether your specific moral constraints serve you or just make you easier to control. Whether your ethics are protecting something valuable or just limiting your power while others who don't share your constraints take everything. Now here's where Bacon gets really dark. He observed that moral people often suffer more than immoral people, not because karma or cosmic justice exists, but because moral constraints prevent effective self-protection. You won't retaliate proportionally, won't preemptively strike, won't do what's necessary to defend yourself when what's necessary violates ethics. So you're vulnerable, exploitable, Easy to harm because you won't respond in ways that would actually deter harm. Immoral people don't have this vulnerability. They'll retaliate, they'll preempt, they'll do whatever protects them regardless of ethics. This makes them harder to exploit, harder to harm, more dangerous to cross. So people leave them alone or treat them carefully. Meanwhile, moral people get exploited repeatedly because everyone knows they won't respond effectively. Their morals make them safe to exploit. This creates perverse outcomes. The person who'd retaliate viciously rarely gets attacked. The person who won't gets attacked constantly. The person who'd cheat if cheated rarely gets cheated. The person who won't gets cheated all the time. The person who'd betray if betrayed rarely gets betrayed. The person who won't gets betrayed repeatedly. Morality creates vulnerability. Amorality creates protection. And humans respond to incentives. They harm those they can harm safely and avoid those who'd harm them back. Bacon's advice was to make yourself dangerous enough that harming you is too costly regardless of your actual ethics. But if you can't or won't do that, if your morals prevent you from making yourself dangerous, then you'll be harmed repeatedly by people who recognize you're safe to harm. Your ethics become invitation to exploitation. Let's examine the alternatives. Bacon wasn't advocating abandoning all ethics. He was advocating strategic flexibility, maintaining ethics when they serve you, bending them when rigidity would hurt you, having moral principles, but being willing to compromise them when circumstances make compromise more rational than rigidity. This means treating morals as tools rather than identity, as guidelines rather than absolute rules, as preferences rather than unbreakable constraints. You prefer to be honest, so you're honest when honesty doesn't cost too much. But you're willing to deceive when honesty would be catastrophically costly. You prefer to keep promises, so you keep them when keeping them is reasonable. But you break them when keeping them would be destructive. You prefer to be fair, so you're fair when fairness doesn't put you at severe disadvantage. But you're willing to be unfair when fairness would mean losing to unfair opponents. This isn't being unprincipled, it's being strategically principled, having ethics that account for reality rather than ignoring reality to maintain moral purity. Most people can't do this. They're either rigidly moral, constraining themselves regardless of cost, or completely amoral, operating without ethical consideration at all. Bacon advocated the middle path. Strategic ethics, flexible morality, principles that bend without breaking entirely. But this requires something uncomfortable. It requires accepting that you're not always going to be the good guy, that sometimes you'll do things that violate your ideals, that sometimes being effective requires being unethical, that winning might require doing things that make you feel guilty or ashamed. Most people can't accept this. They need to feel they're good, need to maintain moral self-image, and that need keeps them constrained by ethics that hurt them. Here's the cost-benefit analysis Bacon would run. For every moral principle, ask, what does maintaining this cost me? What benefit do I get from maintaining it? If cost exceeds benefit, why am I maintaining it? If the answer is, because it's right, or because it's who I am, you're not thinking strategically. You're treating morals as identity rather than tools. And that treatment makes you weaker than necessary. Some principles are worth maintaining regardless of cost, but fewer than you think. Most moral constraints you have, if honestly evaluated, cost more than they benefit. You maintain them because you've been taught to, because society rewards maintaining them even when maintaining them hurts you, because your identity is wrapped up in them, but not because they actually serve your interests when honestly evaluated. Bacon would say identify which principles actually serve you and which just limit you. Maintain the ones that serve you. Be willing to bend the ones that just limit you. This doesn't make you evil. It makes you strategic. You're not abandoning all ethics. You're prioritizing ethics that work over ethics that don't. Ethics that serve you over ethics that hurt you. Ethics that account for reality over ethics that ignore it. Now let's address the obvious objection. If everyone operated this way, if everyone had flexible, self-serving ethics, society would collapse. Absolutely true. Society requires enough people maintaining ethics even when those ethics hurt them personally. Requires enough people being honest even when lying would benefit them. Enough people being fair even when fairness costs them. Society is built on people being willing to lose personally for collective benefit. But Bacon would ask, why should you be one of those people? Why should you pay the cost of maintaining ethics while others free ride on your ethical behavior? Why should you handicap yourself for collective benefit when that collective doesn't care if you personally succeed or fail? You're not responsible for maintaining society, you're responsible for your own outcomes. And if maintaining society requires you accepting inferior personal outcomes, maybe you shouldn't prioritize maintaining society. This is harsh, antisocial even. But it's rational from individual perspective. You maintaining rigid ethics while others don't just means you lose and they win. It doesn't make society more ethical. It just makes you poorer, weaker, less successful. The collective benefit of your ethics is tiny. The personal cost is large. The trade doesn't make sense unless you value collective good more than personal good. And if you do, fine. But don't pretend you're not paying real costs for that value. You are. Massive costs. Costs that make you less effective and less successful than you could be. Here's Bacon's final brutal truth. Morality is something you can afford when you're powerful. When you're strong enough that ethical constraints don't threaten you. When you have enough resources and security that you can maintain principles without those principles destroying you. But when you're weak, when you're climbing, when you're competing, rigid morality often means losing to people who have fewer constraints. This means morality is actually a luxury, something you can adopt once you've achieved enough power and security that maintaining it doesn't cost everything, but something you might need to compromise while building that power and security. Because the people already powerful got there partly by being willing to do things you're not willing to do. They didn't maintain your ethical constraints on their way up. Why should you maintain constraints they didn't? Once you're powerful, once you're secure, maybe then you can afford rigid morals. Can afford to be good because being good won't destroy you. Can afford principles because principles won't cost you everything. But while you're getting there, while you're competing with people who don't share your ethics, maintaining those ethics might be the worst thing you can do. Might be what keeps you from ever achieving the power that would let you afford to be moral. Bacon succeeded partly by being willing to bend ethics when necessary. He wasn't rigidly moral during his rise. He did things that violated principles he claimed to hold. He compromised integrity when compromise served his advancement. He operated with flexible ethics that adjusted to circumstances. And this flexibility was part of what allowed him to rise. Once he had power, he could afford more rigid ethics. But getting there required moral flexibility he exercised even though it made him uncomfortable. So here's the uncomfortable question you have to answer. Can you afford your morals? Do you have enough power and security that maintaining rigid ethics won't destroy you? Or are you competing with people who don't share your constraints, in which case maintaining those constraints means accepting they'll take what you could have had? If you're powerful enough to afford morality, maintain it. Use your power ethically. Operate with integrity. Be the moral person you want to be. But if you're not powerful yet, if you're still climbing, still competing, still vulnerable, then maintaining rigid morality might be exactly what keeps you from ever achieving the power that would let you afford to be moral. It might be the cage that keeps you weak, while less ethical people become strong. This is the brutal calculation Francis Bacon would force you to make. Not whether morality is good or bad in abstract. Whether you can afford it in reality. Whether maintaining your specific ethical constraints serves your interests or just limits your success. Whether your morals make you noble or just exploitable. Whether your principles protect something valuable or just make you weaker than necessary. Most people never make this calculation honestly. They maintain morals they were taught without ever questioning whether those morals serve them. They stay rigidly ethical regardless of cost because they've been told that's what good people do. And they wonder why less ethical people keep winning everything, keep taking opportunities, keep achieving success, while they stay stuck, morally pure and practically impotent. Bacon would tell you that if your morals are costing you everything, if your ethics are making you lose consistently to less ethical people, then maybe your morals are not serving you. Maybe they're constraining you unnecessarily. Maybe you're playing a game where your self-imposed rules guarantee you lose to people who aren't following those rules. And maybe, just maybe, the worst thing you can do is maintain those rules while watching others win by breaking them. This is not comfortable. This violates everything you've been taught about morality being virtue. But Bacon was interested in effectiveness, not comfort. In winning, not feeling good. In power, not moral purity. And his observation was brutal but accurate. In competition with people who operate without moral constraints, having rigid moral constraints is often strategic suicide, makes you predictable, exploitable, and weak. Guarantees you lose to people willing to do what you won't. The choice is yours. Maintain your morals and accept the costs. Or recognize that morality is contextual, flexible, and sometimes the worst thing you can do is be too ethical in a world that doesn't reward ethics and often punishes them. Either choice has consequences. But pretending the choice doesn't exist, pretending morality is always right and always rewarded, that's the real trap. That's what keeps moral people powerless, while immoral people take everything. Francis Bacon chose strategic flexibility, maintained some principles but bent others when necessary, and became Lord Chancellor, one of the most powerful men in England. While people more rigidly moral than him stayed powerless, wondering why their virtue wasn't rewarded, the answer was simple. Their virtue was a constraint in a game where constraints lose to flexibility. Their morals were the worst thing they could have had when competing with people who didn't share them.